A husband's suspicion grows as secrets pile up. Letters from an unknown sender, a stranger at the door, and a wife who's not telling the whole truth. What happens when trust unravels? Enjoy story. The kitchen buzzed with the quiet clatter of silverware as Ethan set the table. His wife, Laura, stood by the stove, stirring a pot, her movements slow and distracted. Tension had built between them for weeks, small, almost imperceptible at first, but growing steadily. Ethan couldn't pinpoint why, but Laura had become distant. Something had shifted. "You work too hard," Laura said, her voice soft but lacking warmth. She turned to him with a small smile, but her eyes held something distant. Ethan forced a chuckle, hoping to lighten the moment. "Just a few more late nights, and I'll have more time for us." "You always say that," she replied, turning back to the stove. Her tone wasn't angry, but the edge was unmistakable. Ethan sighed inwardly, glancing at the clock. It was already past 7. Dinner was ready, roast with herbs, Laura's favorite, but the evening felt like just another chore. Lately, conversation with her had become strained. He thought it was work stress at first, but now it seemed deeper. As he set the last dish on the table, his eyes caught on something, a delicate ivory envelope on the counter, its edges slightly worn. It was handwritten in beautiful calligraphy. "Another letter?" Ethan asked casually, nodding toward it. Laura had been receiving these frequently, always brushing them off when he asked. Laura stiffened, her response delayed. "Yeah, it's from my grandmother again." Her voice was calm, almost defensive. Ethan frowned. He'd never met her grandmother, and Laura had never mentioned being close to that side of the family. Something about the letters bothered him, but he didn't push it tonight. The air between them was tense enough. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. Halfway through the meal, Laura broke the silence. "Chloe might stop by tonight." Her words seemed innocent, but Ethan's stomach tightened. "Your sister?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Didn't she just come over last weekend?" "She has something important to talk about," Laura replied, but there was a flicker of something in her tone, annoyance maybe, or something else. Ethan took a deep breath, suppressing his irritation. Chloe had a knack for bringing tension into their home. It wasn't that he disliked her, but her visits always seemed to make things worse between him and Laura. They ate in near silence, but Ethan's mind drifted back to the letter. Laura's protectiveness over them had grown, and something about it gnawed at him. He wanted to ask more, but the look on her face made him think better of it. He didn't want to start another fight. By 8, the doorbell rang. Laura was on her feet instantly, wiping her hands on a towel as she hurried to the door. Ethan stayed seated, listening. There were voices, Chloe's as expected, but another voice followed. Deep. Male. Unfamiliar. Ethan's gut twisted as Laura reappeared in the doorway, smiling in a way she hadn't in weeks. Behind her stood Chloe, and next to her, a tall man in a charcoal coat. "Ethan, this is Caleb," Laura said, her voice warmer than it had been all evening. "He's an old friend of Chloe's." Ethan stood, shaking Caleb's hand, though something about the man felt off. He was well-dressed, confident, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Nice to meet you," Ethan said, forcing a polite smile. His mind raced. Laura hadn't mentioned anything about Chloe bringing a guest. Caleb smiled back, easy and charming. "Sorry to drop in unannounced. Chloe insisted I come along." "Of course," Ethan replied, though the tension in his chest tightened. The more the merrier. They moved into the living room. But as the evening went on, Ethan felt more and more like an outsider in his own home. Laura seemed lighter, more animated than she'd been in weeks. Caleb's jokes made her laugh, a genuine, bright laugh that Ethan hadn't heard in a long time. At one point, Caleb glanced toward the kitchen. "Those letters, are they real?" he asked, nodding toward the stack of ivory envelopes on the counter. "Not many people write like that anymore." Laura's expression faltered just for a second. Then she smiled. "They're from my grandmother. She's been writing more often lately." Ethan noticed how quickly she moved to change the subject. His suspicions deepened. There was something more to those letters, something Laura wasn't telling him. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, watching the conversation swirl around him. Laura and Chloe were deep into a light-hearted exchange about old family stories, and Caleb seemed to fit seamlessly into the rhythm. His charm was undeniable, but to Ethan, something felt off. Laura, in particular, seemed different. There was an ease about her now, a brightness that he hadn't seen in weeks, and it only intensified when Caleb spoke. She laughed at his jokes, with a carefree spirit Ethan had almost forgotten existed in her. The warmth in her tone when she spoke to Caleb contrasted sharply with the coolness she had shown Ethan earlier. The unease gnawed at him as he sat back, observing more than participating. He glanced at the letters again, piled neatly on the counter. Caleb had pointed them out with casual curiosity, but the moment had passed too quickly. The letters had become an unspoken presence in the room. Ethan tried to shake it off, but the thought lingered. He hadn't asked Laura about them again, not after she brushed it off as correspondence with her grandmother. Yet, the way she handled them, deliberate, almost secretive, told a different story. Eventually, Chloe stretched and let out an exaggerated yawn. "I should get going. Early day tomorrow," she said, rising from her chair. Caleb stood up as well, straightening his jacket. "Yeah, I should head out too. Got some meetings in the morning." Ethan felt a flicker of relief. The night had been uncomfortable, and he was ready for it to end. "It was nice meeting you, Caleb," he said, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "You too, Ethan. Thanks for letting me crash your evening." Caleb's smile was easy, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made Ethan uneasy. Laura walked them to the door, her tone light as she exchanged quick goodbyes with her sister. Caleb lingered for a moment longer, saying something to Laura that Ethan couldn't quite hear. He did, however, hear Laura's response, a soft laugh, the kind she hadn't shared with him in a long time. When she returned to the living room, the air between them felt different, like the tension had shifted but not eased. "Caleb seems nice," Ethan said, forcing casualness into his voice. Laura nodded, her smile still lingering. "Yeah, Chloe's known him for years. He's only in town for a little while." "You two seem to hit it off," Ethan said, watching her closely. Laura shrugged, her smile fading slightly. "He's just a friend, Ethan. Don't read too much into it." Ethan nodded, but something in her response, in the way she brushed him off again, left him uneasy. "What about the letters?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Laura paused, caught off guard by the shift in the conversation. "What about them?" "I don't know. It just seems like you're being secretive about them." Laura's expression shifted, her eyes hardening slightly. "They're personal, Ethan. My grandmother's writing about things from her past. It's not something I want to share with everyone." The answer felt rehearsed, but Ethan couldn't find a reason to challenge it. He didn't want to accuse her outright, not yet. "Okay," he said softly, though his mind was far from settled. They went to bed in silence that night, Laura falling asleep quickly while Ethan lay awake, his thoughts circling back to Caleb. The easy way Laura had interacted with him, the letters, and the way she had been so quick to deflect his questions. It all added up to something he couldn't quite grasp yet, but it gnawed at him relentlessly. The next morning, Ethan found himself alone in the kitchen. Laura had left early, saying she had errands to run, though she didn't offer specifics. As he stood there, his eyes fell on the pile of letters once again. He hesitated, a wave of guilt washing over him at the thought of invading her privacy. But the doubt, the gnawing uncertainty, pushed him forward. He walked over to the counter, picking up the top envelope. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, the paper thick and luxurious. It didn't look like the kind of letter one would receive from an elderly relative. And as his eyes scanned the words, his stomach dropped. The letter wasn't filled with sentimental family stories. Instead, it contained cryptic phrases, almost poetic, but unsettling. "The night is ours. The time we spoke of draws closer. Be ready. Ethan's pulse quickened. The tone was intimate, conspiratorial. This wasn't something a grandmother would write. Before he could read further, the sound of the front door opening startled him. Quickly, Ethan folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, his heart racing. Laura walked into the kitchen, her face bright, holding a grocery bag. "Hey, I picked up some things for dinner," she said cheerfully. Ethan forced a smile, his mind still reeling from the letter. "Great," he replied, though his voice sounded distant. As Laura started unpacking, Ethan watched her closely, feeling the weight of the secret now resting between them. The evening unfolded like any other, with Laura bustling around the kitchen, preparing dinner as if nothing had changed. But for Ethan, everything had. The words from the letter echoed in his mind, each cryptic phrase laced with suspicion. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Laura was hiding, it was far more than just an emotional distance. His hands clenched at the table, trying to focus on the mundane sounds of dinner being prepared. By the time they sat down to eat, the silence between them felt heavier than it had in weeks. "Chloe's coming by later this week," Laura said casually, cutting into her roast. She mentioned needing some help with something. Ethan raised an eyebrow, but said nothing at first. His mind flashed back to Chloe's visits, to Caleb's appearance the other night, and to the letter. The tension had been building, and this felt like just another piece of the puzzle falling into place. He set down his fork, watching Laura carefully. "Is Caleb coming with her?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Laura paused, just for a second. "I don't think so," she said, a bit too quickly. "Why?" "Just curious." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze still locked on her. "You two seemed close the other night." Laura didn't meet his eyes. "Like I said, he's Chloe's friend." Ethan nodded slowly, but the tightness in his chest only grew. He felt like he was on the outside of a conversation happening between Laura and someone else, maybe Caleb, maybe even Chloe. The distance between them wasn't just physical anymore. It was as if there was an entire world of thoughts and secrets she was deliberately keeping from him. "Are you sure there's nothing you want to tell me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost testing the waters. Laura's eyes flicked up to meet his, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Ethan said, shrugging. "Lately you've been different, distant. And those letters." He trailed off, watching her closely. Laura's face hardened slightly, her defenses going up. "I told you they're from my grandmother." Ethan leaned forward, unable to stop himself now. "But they're not, are they?" Laura stared at him, her jaw tightening. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the air between them thick with unspoken accusations. "Why are you doing this?" she finally said, her voice low, tense. "Why are you pushing this?" "Because something's wrong, Laura," Ethan replied, frustration rising in his chest. "You've been keeping secrets, and I'm tired of pretending everything's fine." Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said coldly. "You're imagining things." Ethan stood too, his temper flaring. "Am I?" "Then explain the letter I read this morning, the one that wasn't from your grandmother." Laura froze, her eyes wide with shock, but she quickly masked it. "You went through my things?" Her voice wavered with anger, but Ethan could hear the fear behind it. "I had to," Ethan snapped. "You weren't going to tell me the truth." Laura's expression shifted, her anger hardening into something more brittle. She took a deep breath, her voice colder now. "I can't believe you would invade my privacy like that." "Privacy?" Ethan's voice rose. "We're married, Laura. We're supposed to share things, not keep secrets. And whatever's going on with these letters, with Caleb, I deserve to know." Laura turned away, her back rigid, as she gripped the counter. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Ethan demanded, stepping closer. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like you're hiding something big." Laura didn't respond immediately, her shoulders tense as she stared at the wall. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand, Ethan. It's complicated. Ethan felt a surge of frustration. Then make me understand. Laura turned slowly, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, guilt, maybe both. It's not about Caleb, not really, she said, her voice cracking slightly. It's about my past. Ethan blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift. Your past? What do you mean? Laura swallowed, struggling to find the words. The letters. They're from someone who knows things about my family, about things that happened years ago. Things I've never told you because I didn't want to drag you into it. Ethan's heart pounded, his mind racing. Who's sending them? What do they want? I don't know, Laura admitted, her voice shaky. They've been coming for years, even before we met. I thought it would stop, but now it's getting worse. Ethan's frustration softened slightly, replaced by a flicker of concern. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Because I didn't want you to get involved, Laura whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I thought I could handle it on my own, that it would go away. But now, I don't know what to do. For a moment, Ethan was silent, trying to process what she had just told him. The cryptic phrases in the letters, the sudden appearance of Caleb, the strange way Laura had been acting. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle he still couldn't fully see. And Caleb? Ethan asked cautiously. How does he fit into all of this? Laura hesitated, biting her lip. He's involved, but not in the way you think. I reached out to him for help when he came back to town. He knows more about the letters, about the person sending them. He was trying to help me figure it out. Ethan's mind reeled. Caleb helping her? The man who seemed so perfectly comfortable stepping into their lives, who shared secret smiles and private jokes with Laura. Why didn't you just tell me? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I could have helped. Laura looked at him. Guilt etched into her face. I didn't want to burden you. I didn't want you to get dragged into something dangerous. Dangerous? Ethan repeated, his stomach sinking. Before Laura could answer, the doorbell rang, echoing through the house like a gunshot. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he saw the fear flash across Laura's face. They both stood frozen, the sudden intrusion jarring them back into the present. I wasn't expecting anyone, Ethan said, his voice tight. Laura shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. Neither was I. Ethan moved toward the door, his mind racing. As he opened it, a tall man stood on the doorstep, dressed in a dark suit. His expression was calm, too calm, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Ethan, the man said smoothly. We need to talk about Laura. Ethan stared at the man, his heart pounding. The man's calm demeanor was unnerving, and the way he said Laura's name set off alarm bells in Ethan's mind. Behind him, Laura stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale. Her eyes darted to Ethan, filled with fear and something else, guilt. Who are you? Ethan demanded, his voice tight, trying to mask the sudden wave of unease creeping through him. The man smiled faintly, stepping forward. I'm here on behalf of someone Laura knows, he said smoothly. She knows what this is about. Ethan glanced back at Laura, but she was silent, her body stiff. He turned back to the man, stepping in front of him, blocking the doorway. If you have something to say, you can say it to both of us. The man's eyes flickered with something dark, though his smile never faltered. This isn't a conversation you're a part of, Ethan. Laura and I need to discuss unfinished business. Ethan clenched his fists, his pulse racing. Whatever you think is going on here, you're not stepping foot in this house. Laura's voice, small and trembling, broke the standoff. Ethan, please, she whispered. Let him in. Ethan whipped around, shocked by her words. What? Who is this guy, Laura? What's going on? The man remained quiet, his presence looming in the doorway. Laura stepped forward, her eyes pleading as they met Ethan's. I'll explain everything. Just let him in, please. Ethan's gut screamed at him to slam the door, to shut this man out of their lives. But the desperation in Laura's voice stopped him cold. She wasn't asking out of fear for herself. She was afraid of what would happen if he didn't let the man in. Reluctantly, Ethan stepped aside, allowing the man into their home. The stranger moved with quiet confidence, as though he'd already won a battle Ethan didn't even know they were fighting. They all sat in the living room, tension filling the space like a fog. Ethan remained on edge, his eyes locked on the man, waiting for answers. The stranger leaned back, folding his hands. "Laura, you've been avoiding this for far too long. You know why I'm here." Ethan shot Laura a look, his frustration boiling over. "Start talking, Laura." Laura's eyes dropped to her lap, her hands trembling as she spoke. "It's about the letters," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not from my grandmother. They're from him. From Caleb." Ethan's mind spun. "Caleb? What does he want?" Laura swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "He's been trying to manipulate me, Ethan. He's using secrets from my past, things I've buried, to get to me. These letters, they're threats, reminders of things I never wanted to face again." Ethan's stomach twisted. "And this guy?" He gestured toward the stranger. "What's he got to do with any of this?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I work for Caleb. He's made certain arrangements, and I'm here to ensure Laura holds up her end of the deal." Ethan's fists clenched. "Deal? What deal?" Laura looked like she might collapse under the weight of the moment. "Years ago, before I met you, Caleb and we were involved. He helped me through some dark times, but there were things he never let go of. When he came back into my life, I thought it was harmless, that it was just old memories. But now he wants something I can't give him." "What does he want, Laura?" Ethan's voice was sharp, the patience wearing thin. The man interjected smoothly. "He wants her." The words hung in the air, cold and final. Ethan felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. He turned to Laura, disbelief and anger warring within him. "You were going to leave me for him? After everything?" Laura shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, Ethan. I swear I didn't want any of this. I've been trying to push him away, but he's been relentless. The letters, the threats, he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Ethan's breath came in shallow bursts, his mind reeling from the betrayal and the madness of it all. Caleb's presence in their lives hadn't just been some harmless reunion. He had been actively trying to break them apart, to claim Laura for himself. But something didn't add up. "Why now?" Ethan demanded, turning back to the man. "Why come here tonight? What's changed?" The stranger's expression darkened. "Caleb is tired of waiting. Laura's made promises, whether she acknowledges them or not, and Caleb expects them to be fulfilled." Laura's voice broke, desperation bleeding into every word. "I never promised him anything. He's twisting everything, using my past against me, making it sound like I owe him something. But I don't, Ethan. I don't want to leave you." Ethan stood, his body shaking with anger. "Get out," he growled at the stranger. "You tell Caleb whatever promises he thinks Laura made don't mean anything. This ends tonight." The man rose slowly, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Caleb doesn't take kindly to being denied, but I'll pass on the message." He paused by the door, his voice lowering. "Just know this isn't over." With that, he walked out, leaving the door hanging open in his wake. Ethan turned to Laura, his mind a whirlwind of rage, confusion, and disbelief. "Is this why you've been so distant? Because of him? You should have told me, Laura. I could have helped." Laura collapsed into the couch, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know how. I was scared that if you knew you'd leave me. Scared of what Caleb would do if I told you the truth." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "What does he have over you? What could be so terrible that you'd let him do this to us?" Laura looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. "It's not just about Caleb. It's about everything. My past, the mistakes I made before I met you. He knows things about me, about my family, that I never wanted you to know." Ethan stopped pacing, staring at her. "I don't care about your past, Laura. I care about what's happening now." Laura wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "He's going to come after us, Ethan. He's not going to stop." Ethan's jaw clenched. Then we'll make him stop. The next few days passed in a haze for Ethan. Every time he looked at Laura, all he could see were the secrets she had been keeping from him. The mysterious letters, Caleb's invasive presence, and the stranger's visit loomed over their home like a dark cloud. Ethan felt suffocated, trapped in a marriage where the person he loved most had become a stranger. Nights were the worst. Laura would slip into bed beside him, her body curling into his like it always had, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Ethan found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he had missed the signs, how he had let things fall apart so badly. The worst part was, despite everything, he still loved her. That love was tangled up with anger and frustration, but it was still there, pulling him in even as his trust in her unraveled. One evening, as they sat in their usual silence over dinner, Ethan finally spoke. "We need to figure this out, Laura. You can't keep shutting me out." Laura, who had been pushing her food around on her plate, looked up with tired eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I just don't know how." Ethan's frustration flared. "You start by telling me everything. No more half-truths, no more hiding things. I deserve to know what's really going on." Laura set down her fork and rubbed her temples. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad, Ethan. I thought I could handle it. I thought Caleb would just go away if I ignored him long enough." "But he didn't," Ethan said sharply. "You can't just ignore people like Caleb. He's been sending those letters for weeks, and who knows what else he's been planning. You should have come to me sooner." "I know." Laura's voice cracked, tears springing to her eyes. "I know I should have, but I didn't want you to see what kind of person I was before I met you." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? What does your past have to do with this?" Laura wiped her eyes, struggling to find the right words. "Caleb, he wasn't just some fling. We were involved, deeply involved, for years before you and I ever met. He knows things about me, things I'm not proud of, and now he's using that against me." Ethan's heart pounded. "What kind of things?" Laura hesitated, her voice lowering to barely a whisper. "I made mistakes back then, big ones. Caleb helped me out of some of them, but it was never just about helping. He always wanted something in return. And now he thinks I owe him. That's why he's back." Ethan stood up from the table, pacing the room. "So he's blackmailing you? What is he threatening to do?" Laura shook her head, her face pale. "Not exactly blackmail. He's not asking for money. He wants me to go back to him to be with him. He's convinced that I belong to him because of everything we went through together." Ethan stopped pacing, staring at her in disbelief. "And you think you can just make him stop by talking to him?" "I don't know what to think," Laura cried, standing up as well. "I've tried everything, Ethan. I've told him I'm not interested, that I've moved on, but he doesn't listen. He's convinced that if he pushes hard enough, I'll give in." Ethan's fists clenched. The anger inside him boiled over. "And you didn't think to tell me any of this? I've been sitting here, trying to piece together what's going on while you've been dealing with this psycho alone." "I didn't want you to get involved," Laura shouted back, her voice thick with tears. "I didn't want him to turn his attention to you. He's dangerous, Ethan. I didn't want you to get hurt." Ethan's anger simmered down into something colder, something harder. "You're wrong, Laura. By keeping this from me, you've made it worse. Now he's not just a problem for you. He's a problem for both of us. And I'm not going to sit around while he tries to tear our lives apart." The next morning, Ethan woke with a resolve he hadn't felt in days. He couldn't let this go on any longer. He had to confront Caleb, had to put an end to this nightmare before it spiraled even further out of control. He didn't tell Laura his plan. She would try to stop him, and he couldn't afford that now. Ethan spent the morning tracking down Caleb's contact information. He knew Chloe had mentioned that Caleb worked in real estate, and after a bit of digging online, Ethan found the business page that listed his office address. It was enough. That afternoon, Ethan drove to the edge of town, to a small, upscale office complex, where Caleb's name was neatly displayed on the directory. His heart pounded as he stepped inside. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew this was something he had to do alone. When he arrived at Caleb's office, he found the door slightly ajar. Without hesitation, Ethan pushed it open and stepped inside. Caleb was sitting behind his desk, looking as calm and collected as ever. "Well, this is a surprise," Caleb said, leaning back in his chair. His smile was the same smug, self-assured expression Ethan had seen the last time they met. "We need to talk," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. Caleb's smile widened. "Of course. Sit down. Let's chat." Ethan remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. "You need to stay away from Laura. Whatever you think she owes you, it's over. She's with me now and you need to move on." Caleb raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You think it's that simple? You think a little talk is going to make me disappear?" Ethan's temper flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm telling you this ends now. Laura doesn't want anything to do with you." Caleb's eyes darkened, his smile fading. "You don't understand, Ethan. Laura and we have history, deep history. You can't just erase that. She'll always have a connection to me, whether she likes it or not. And you can't stop that." Ethan stepped forward, his voice hardening. "She's not yours, Caleb. Whatever you think you had with her, it's over. She chose me." Caleb stood, leaning over his desk, his eyes blazing with intensity. "You don't know her like I do. You don't know what she's capable of, what she's done." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "I know everything I need to know, and I know that she's not going to let you control her anymore." Caleb's laugh was cold, mocking. "You think you can save her for me? Laura has secrets, Ethan. Dark secrets. She's not as innocent as you think." Ethan's fists tightened, but he held his ground. "Whatever her past is, it's not your business anymore." Caleb stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ethan. You have no idea what Laura's hiding, and when you find out, you're going to wish you'd walked away." Ethan glared at him, his voice a low growl. "I'm not afraid of you, Caleb, and I'm not going to let you tear us apart." For a moment, they stood face to face, the tension crackling in the air between them. Then, Caleb's smile returned, but it was sharper this time, more sinister. "We'll see, Ethan. We'll see." Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out, his heart racing. The confrontation had been intense, but he knew one thing for sure: Caleb wasn't going to stop easily. This was far from over. When Ethan returned home, Laura was waiting for him, pacing anxiously in the living room. Her face lit up with a mix of relief and fear when she saw him. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I went to see Caleb," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I told him to back off." Laura's eyes widened in shock. "You did what?" "Ethan, you shouldn't have done that. He's dangerous." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice softening. "But this ends now. We can't keep living like this. Caleb's not going to stop on his own, so I had to confront him." Laura shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't understand. Caleb doesn't just give up. He'll come after us. He'll come after you." Ethan walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll face him together. We'll be ready for whatever he throws at us." Laura looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I should have told you everything from the beginning. I should have trusted you." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "It's okay. We're going to get through this. But you have to stop keeping things from me. No more secrets, Laura. We're in this together." Laura nodded, her tears falling onto his shoulder. "I promise, Ethan. No more secrets." Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to improve. Ethan and Laura worked to rebuild their trust, focusing on strengthening their bond and being open with each other. They had confronted Caleb, and for now, the letters had stopped. But neither of them believed it was truly over. Caleb wasn't someone who gave up easily, and Ethan knew he was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Laura resting her head on Ethan's shoulder. She sighed softly. "Do you think we'll ever really be free of him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "I don't know, but as long as we have each other, we'll get through whatever comes next." Laura smiled, her fingers lacing with his. "I never thought we'd make it this far. I thought he'd destroy us." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "He tried, but he didn't." For the first time in months, they allowed themselves a moment of peace. The storm that Caleb had brought into their lives might not be over, but they had survived the worst of it together. Yet deep down, Ethan knew that Caleb wasn't gone. He was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next move. And as long as that was true, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly free.